Hello there, welcome to our continued discussion on Indian English poetry. If you quickly recall, we have been discussing some of the major Indian English poets over the couple of classes. We discussed Nizam Ezekiel, we discussed Kamala Das, we discussed Eunice D'Souza, and in this class we are going to discuss another equally significant poet. But of course, before we get to know the poet, I thought it's better we get ourselves acquainted with his poetry, all right, because poetry, it is said, of course, you require a poet to write poetry, but it's said that great poetry happens not because of the poet, but in spite of him or in spite of the poet. Just think about it. Do you agree with it, or you want to say anything about this? And in the meanwhile, we come back. I say about best poetry happening in spite of the poet because great poetry has the capacity to kindle within us something atavistic, something something which is deep. Hidden deep within the core, something like that. So, we are going to read one such poem, and maybe after that we can get to know the poet, all right. So, here comes the poem. Let us see what we can gather out of this poem. We have been discussing poetry for very many classes now. So, see if you can spot some important devices, literary devices the poet uses, and what is the poem trying to project, portray here. The day after the first rain, for years I would home in a rage, for I could see from a mile away our 3 red champak trees had done it again, had burst into flower and given mother her first blinding migraine of the season. With a street-long, heavy-hung, yellow pollen fog of a fragrance no wind could sift, no door could shut out from our bleak pillared house whose walls had ears and eyes. Scales, smells, bone creaks, nightly visiting voices, and were porous like us. I am sure you are noticing here how the house is being compared to human life. Like us, they too have eyes, ears, scales, smells, bone creaks and all that. Please go on noticing various other literary devices and see how using all of them the poem brings alive the verbal picture here. And there is also, if you have noticed, there is a kind of a hidden conflict which is brewing in these lines, and probably in the next couple of stanzas the conflict becomes all the more evident. See if you can spot that conflict and how that propels the entire poem, it pushes the poem forward. But mother, flashing a temper like her mother's twisted silver, grandchildren's knickers, wet as the cold pack on her head, would not let us cut down a flowering tree, almost as old as her, seeded, she said, by a passing bird's providential droppings, to give her gods and her daughters and daughters' daughters basket full of annual flower, and for one line of cousins a dower of migraines in season. So, how using simple language the poet presents a picture that dramatizes a kind of a minor conflict that happens there, and how the poem gets its impetus from this conflict and all that. If you have been a sensitive reader, which you definitely are, you will have noticed that the poem makes use of certain words and certain images. For instance, champak tree, well, this is something that all of us are familiar with, right? Therefore, could it be an Indian poet, right, or at least somebody who is well versed with the flora and fauna of India, right, could be an Indian poet. That is the first doubt we get in our mind. And because the poem is written in English, this poet must be well versed in Indian English poetry, because the poem reads so well, so smoothly, all right. So, you have learned to identify, just based on reading the poem, you have already begun identifying, constructing the background, all right. So, and looking at the structure, well, it looks like an enjambed poem, right. Of course, you learned this word during one of our quiz shows, right, enjambment. It is a poetic device, a poetic technique where a particular line runs across several lines. In fact, here cutting across stanzas, you can even say that this entire poem is one single sentence. So, this is so beautifully rhythmically enjambed. Therefore, you might have even spotted this enjambed structure here. Definitely, it makes use of free verse. There is no, it is not written in any particular meter or does not follow any particular rhyme scheme as such. Therefore, it is a free verse. And you will have also seen the poet fluently making use of simile, metaphor, personification and various other literary devices. And of course, thematically speaking, the poem projects an ambivalent relationship that exists between nature and especially the poetic persona, and how there is a kind of a difference even in the poem, how mother opposes her son's idea of cutting the tree. Despite the inconveniences it causes her, she wants to retain it, and how that builds a little tension there, and what is the reason behind that, the religious reasons behind behind her sentiment, not to cut the tree and all that. You will have noticed it, right. See how using different images and words, the poem portrays an entire complex life situation here, right. So, if you have spotted these things, or at least some of them, well, you have really learned to read a poem, in its proper spirit. You are right, the poem we just read is called Ecology, one of the most anthologized poems by a gifted Indian English poet called AK Ramanujan, who lived for about 60 years, and within that such a short span of time, he produced remarkable works that have an indelible mark on the future poets. So, he has left a kind of an extraordinary literary legacy. So, now is the time to now is the time for us to get to know the poet a little better, now that we have identified him as AK Ramanujan. Ramanujan is from Mysore, Karnataka. He taught in Maharaja's College. He was a student of Maharaja's College, and of course, then he moved on to various other places before he went and finally settled in the US. He taught in the University of Chicago for very many years. He was a polyglot, please, in case there are some words that you are not familiar with, please make yourself familiar with these words. He was well versed with several languages, especially Kannada, Tamil, Telugu, Sanskrit and English. He could read in all the 5 languages and write in at least 3 of them, and whatever he has written in these 3 languages, it is really very significant. Okay? And he was also posthumously awarded the Central Sahitya Academy Award for his collected poems. Yeah, as I said, after spending a couple of years teaching across India, then he moves on to US, and there he begins to teach in the University of Chicago, and there he strengthens the Department of South Asian Studies and all that. Some of his seminal essays that are widely read include Is There an Indian Way of Thinking, 300 Ramayanas, 5 examples and 3 thoughts on translation. If you recall, this was in the eye of a storm for different reasons. Nevertheless, it's a remarkable scholarship. The literary piece displays a remarkable scholarship, especially Is There an Indian Way of Thinking, opens up new vistas as far as understanding epistemological constructions. He has he was not just a poet, he was a playwright, he was a linguist, philologist to be precise, folklorist and all that. So, his contribution, again we can call him a multifaceted personality, a genius in many fields. So, some of his collected works include Folk Tales from India, Flowering Tree and Other Oral Tales from India, beautifully edited tales. If you really want to immerse yourself in extraordinary tales of India, you can go through them. Okay. And he was also an acclaimed translator. His translations from Tamil and Kannada are masterpieces. They are read by students of literature in general and students of translation studies in particular for their remarkable rendering of the Kannada Vachana poets and Sangam poetry from Tamil in fine English, in extraordinary English. In fact, the poem, these translations are recreations of ancient classics. Okay. And apart from these scholarly ventures, he has also written a couple of poetry collections, The Striders, which came out in 66, followed by Relations and all that. In 1995, his collected works collected poems comes out, and after his death, his wife and a couple of his friends bring out uncollected poems and prose. All right, these are some of his important books. AK Ramanujan's poetry is appreciated in the literary circles, in the critical circles, because of its exquisite sense of language and rhythm. In fact, if you read, it's a beautiful, his poetry imitates extraordinary cadences of English language in such a way that it's a verbal melody. If you read his poems properly, you can hear the entire language dancing, right? You can hear the language dancing. I said, you please pay careful attention to that sentence and see if it makes any sense. All right. AK Ramanujan's poetry reflects many moods, many sentiments, especially because of his exposure to the Western tradition, and because of his he eventually settled there. There was a kind of a constant anxiety to seek out his roots. That's the reason why he goes on to translate from Kannada and Tamil, which are his roots, right? So, you can say that his poems are a fine embodiment of Indianness. And if you wish to spot a couple of recurring themes in him, of course, you can't confine a poet to a few themes, but of course, a poet is also preoccupied with certain concerns that haunt him. So, some of those concerns for Ramanujan were the relationship between human body and the nature around. So, this equation is found across all his poetry collections, in several poems across his collections. So, here is an excerpt from a poem called Towards Simplicity from his second collection of poems. Corpuscle, skin cell and membrane, each has its minute seasons clocked within the bones. Each has its minute seasons clocked within the bones. Millions grow lean and fall away in the early autumn of the body, into the soil, as soil we come, into the soil, as soil we come. It talks about, now look at how the internal, the organic and the mechanical functions of body, how they find some kind of parallels in the vocabulary of nature around internal autumns, then the clock, the biological clock that he is talking of. Finally, into the soil, as soil we come. Isn't it the great philosophy that almost all religions preach, that we are dust and to dust we shall return. That is what all schools of philosophy discuss. At the end of the day, from this journey between cradle and grave, all that remains is how beautifully we engage ourselves with the world around. That is the only part we can call life. So, this kind of interconnectedness of body, nature, rituals, culture is what excite the poet. Therefore, you can call him in a sense a mystic, because you find in his poetry a lot of metaphysical and mystical influences. He was deeply influenced by the cosmopolitan outlook that is present in the Indian Upanishads especially, and he was greatly influenced by bhakti poetry, and he was an extraordinary translator of some of the finest bhakti poetry of India, especially Vachana poetry and Alvar poetry, Sangam poetry, and all that he has done. So, you can call him again a confluence of the best of the East and the West that you can find in his poetry. That is why he becomes a remarkable poet. All right. So, this is in general a bit of background to the poet. Now that we know the poet a little bit better, let us go and explore one more poem of his, Children, Dreams and Theorems. Of course, whenever we discuss any poem like this, please go on spotting something that is familiar to you, based on your understanding of these classes. If you can spot some poetic devices and some patterns using which the poet portrays his or her inner turmoils, you have achieved a remarkable feat. Children, Dreams, Theorems. Look how he compares all of them, children, dreams, theorems. Children, like dream, get lost if they are not held close, caressed, kissed, named. Again, even in this poem, lines are beautifully enjambed, and pay closer attention to the internal rhythms of English language, how they flow like water. Dreams, like poems, get lost if their tales are not knotted for memory. Poems, like father's midnight theorems, get lost if you do not talk to them, take their part in a quarrel with their rival theorems. Like dead languages, get lost if you do not smell them early and change their diapers, sprinkle talcum on their bottoms. Again, beautiful similes, metaphors, personifications, how dead languages, how languages die if you do not care for them, if you do not care for them, if you do not change the diapers, sprinkle talcum on the bottoms. I am sure it is rich with the imagery of a small baby, like how we tend to the baby and care for it, we need to tend to the language and care for it, something like that. An extraordinary comparison, children, dreams and theorems. Okay. Yeah, before we end the discussion on AK Ramanujan, here are some more poems that you can pick up. It is easily available. These poems are easily available even on internet. You can please read them. If this poet interests you, you can please read some of these poems: Death and the Good Citizen, Farewell, Chicago Zen, Lying, Self-Portrait, Obituary, and all of them. All right. So, I am sure the poet has already piqued your interest. So, it would be really wonderful if you can follow him up and read some of his poems that are freely available on the internet. From AK Ramanujan, let us move on to another significant Indian English poet called Jayanta Mahapatra. of course, the tagline says the pet poet of Puri, because Puri, Konark, Cuttack, Bhuvaneshwar, So, the poet is influenced by, in fact, he went on to say that the poet in him was born because of his close association with Puri and Cuttack. If not for these cities, the poet in him would not have come out at all, something like that. That is why we call him the pet poet of Puri, right. Jayanta Mahapatra, a remarkable poet. Well, by birth, he was born in a Christian family in Cuttack in 1928, and again, the singular distinction is here that he is the first poet to have received the Sahitya Academy Award, which is one of the top notch awards in India for writers. Is the first poet, Indian English poet, to have received that honor. Okay. By profession, he was he is a professor of physics, yet he was drawn towards the world of language. He was drawn more towards the world of language than towards the universe around. Therefore, he is a remarkable poet. So, with his extraordinary background in physics, the way he explores the philosophical dimensions of the subject through language is something remarkable. Yeah, he still lives in Cuttack and a remarkable poet. I am sure when you read some of his poems, you will realize how great a poet Mahapatra is. Mahapatra is one of the prolific writers we have in India, because he has more than 40 books to his credit. In fact, he is a bilingual writer, like many of our Indian English writers. Remember, we said Kamala Das was a bilingual writer, Arun Kolatkar was a bilingual writer, and that continuing that legacy, we have here Jayanta Mahapatra, like AK Ramanujan. They are all bilingual writers. In fact, some of them are even multilingual writers. So, more than 40 books to his credit. Some of his well known poetry collections include Shadow Space, Relationship, Bare Face, A Rain of Rights, something like this. And he has also written some remarkable memoirs, and that is something that we have to keep in mind. His contribution is also in the journal that he edited, in an influential journal that he edited called Chandrabhaga. In fact, Chandrabhaga is synonymous with quality Indian English poetry even to this day. In a sort of speaking, Chandrabhaga offered many young Indian English poets a rite of passage, and they had to pass through that in order to be considered major Indian English poets. The journal provided them that kind of rite of passage. So, that is a remarkable contribution to Indian English poetry. For him, he said that poetry liberated not just the poet who wrote it, but also the reader who read, because it produces in their minds an effect beyond the ordinary. That is precisely what he meant. A poetry for him was a liberating force, not just for the poet, but also for the readers. And he went on to say that I shall go on writing my poems as long as the sun goes on shining, both on the president's gardens and on the rat-riddled shacks in my own town. Now, look, this is the beauty of poetry, right? I said earlier, poetry at its core is egalitarian. Well, it does not discriminate between the huts of the poor people and the mansions of kings and presidents and prime ministers. So, a poet in that sense is a true democrat, a true egalitarian, and his or her poetry embodies that spirit of oneness. My poems deal with the life within myself, where the mind tries to find a sort of coherence from the mass of things in the world outside it. Again, these are some lines by Jayanta Mahapatra. So, let us go and quickly take a look at least one of his poems before we end this class. Okay. So, a taste for tomorrow. This poem is set in the backdrop of Puri. Again, recall the tagline, Puri's pet poet. At Puri, the crows, again minimalism, use of minimalism in words, economy of expression. The one wide street lolls out like a giant tongue. How beautifully compares the street to a giant tongue and how it lolls out like a giant tongue. 5 faceless lepers move aside as a priest passes by, and at the street's end, the crowds thronging the temple door, a huge holy flower swaying in the wind of greater reasons. Look how beautifully the poet juxtaposes the mundane with the divine. So, here is the temple door, which can lead you onto a different portal, and the crowd of people, they are thronging the door, and there are a couple of lepers, there is a priest who comes by. How beautifully the poet juxtaposes the mundane, the routine with the magical, the divine, and things. That is why, beautiful verbal picture. I have another remarkable poem, Dholi. Dholi is an important historical place. Dholi is, historically speaking, Dholi is a place where it is said Ashoka's great Kalinga battle seemed to have spanned, it's Dholi hills were the regions historians identify where Ashoka's great the Kalinga Yuddha seemed to have taken place, and Ashoka realized the futility of war and bloodshed, and later he renounced violence, embraces Buddhism, and as a mark of in order to expiate for his sins through wars, he spreads Buddhism and all that. This is the Shanti Stupa that you find in Dholi. So, this poem is a remarkable tribute to that. Afterwards, when the wars of Kalinga were over, the fallow fields of Dholi hid the blood-spilled, butchered bodies, as the earth burrowed into their dead hunger with its merciless wombs, guided the foxes to their limp genitals. Years later, the evening wind, trembling the glazed waters of the river Daya. In fact, river Daya is again there in Dholi. It's just about 10-15 kilometers away from Bhubaneswar, the capital of Odisha. How using again these geographical markers become, how they evince the poetic spirit of kindness, the kind spirit, and how even years later, how whatever Ashoka did cannot do justice to the number of soldiers he killed in war, or it's too late and too little, probably the poet feels, and that is why he says the measure of Ashoka's suffering does not appear enough, it is too little and too late. The place of his pain peers lamentably from among the pains of the dead. Thank you very much. I am glad that we could discuss very many Indian English poets. Of course, the list is not exhaustive, it is just illustrative. If Indian English poetry interests you, along with the poets we have discussed, you can even read the poetry of Aga Shahid Ali, you can read the poetry of Ranjit Hoskote, you can read the poetry of Kartika Nair, Arundhati Subramaniam. All of them are remarkable young writers, including Jeet Tayal. So, you can read some of these poets and enjoy. All right. So, next week we come up with some more discussion of poetry, this time from around the globe. Until then, take care. Bye bye.